After the break, the brand new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, joins me live.
Okay, ready? You raise your right hand. I, Peter Buttigieg,
I, Peter Buttigieg,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States,
the Constitution of the United States,
that I will well and faithfully discharge
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties of the office
the duties of the office
which I am about to enter,
which I am about to enter.
so help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. Secretary. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Vice President. Congratulations.
Yesterday, the nation's first black and Asian woman vice president swore in the country's first openly gay cabinet secretary, Pete Buttigieg, one-time presidential candidate and former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And I am joined now by the self-same Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. I want to first thank you for making this your first interview since your confirmation. I got to take you back to that moment. What was going through your mind? I mean, you're standing there making history and breaking the internet, you, Chasten, and the vice president. What was going through your mind in that moment?
Oh, it's extraordinary. You know, the vice president said to me just before we stepped out there, make sure to be present because it'll go by quickly. And she was right, and I'm glad she did. But when I paused just to think about what it meant, you know, to have my hand on the Bible that my grandfather gave my mother when she was a child, held by my husband, taking an oath administered by the first woman, first black, first Asian vice president. What an extraordinary moment. The second gentleman stopped by and joined us. He's friends with Chasten, and just to be able to say a sentence like, you know, the vice president and her husband were there with me and my husband Chasten. Just to say a sentence like that tells you how much has changed in 2021, even though we've got a long way to go as a country.
Now, see, I could spend the whole rest of our interview asking you, have you moved yet? Like, how are you loving D.C.? But I'm not going to do that because I am one of the maybe small number of people in America that I am obsessed with trains. I love trains. I think trains are the most civilized way to travel. I am actually excited about the Secretary of Transportation position in general, but you being in it changes the game. Not only is it making history, but you have a chance to, as a former mayor, really dig in and make some changes. How long is it going to take before I get my high-speed rail?
Well, I'll tell you, I can't wait. I feel the same way you do. And as you know, the president's a big believer in passenger rail, too. Look, we've been asked to settle for less in this country. And I just don't know why people in other countries ought to have better train service and more investment in high-speed train service than Americans do. You know, Amtrak has done a heroic job with the constraints that have been placed on them. Now we've got to take things to the next level. You know, you look at what, not just famously, you know, let's say our fellow, you know, our counterparts in Japan are able to enjoy, but, you know, really across the world, a place like the UK or Turkey. I want the U.S. to be leading the world when it comes to access to high-speed rail, and I think we have a real opportunity to do that, especially with the bipartisan appetite for real investments that we have before us this year.
Well, it felt bipartisan at a certain point. I mean, we had infrastructure week like literally every week during the previous administration. They never actually did it. Republicans talk a good game saying they want it too. It creates lots of jobs, there's lots of opportunity, but they keep hedging because they want it to be privately owned. You know, that was the Rick Scott issue, that they didn't like the idea of the public investing in high-speed rail. They wanted to just be private companies. How do you break that logjam? If you could answer that, and then also, how do you ensure that we don't get another Overtown, that we're not, you know, vivisecting communities of color and putting people of color in a worse situation than they started?
Yeah, that piece is especially important. In fact, today is Transportation Equity Day because it's the birthday of Rosa Parks. Now, I know when you think about all the areas of federal government that deal with racial justice, people don't always think first of the Department of Transportation, but the example of Rosa Parks reminds us how much is at stake. And as you said, you know, it's not just about things like, you know, what the Montgomery bus boycott was about and equitable access to transit, but it's the fact that sometimes, you know, investment came to black neighborhoods neighborhoods all right, but it came in the worst possible way, a highway destroying that neighborhood. You shared that Overtown example. There are examples from Nashville to Richmond to Pittsburgh. And we've got to make sure, first of all, that our policies recognize that history of harm, where this magnificent thing of creating the interstate highway system was so often done with terrible consequences for communities of color. And now we have a chance to get it right. We have a chance to make investments that expand opportunity instead of cutting people off from opportunity, that build and enrich neighborhoods instead of breaking them up. And that's got to be central to the federal transportation policy vision, but also as we're working with different communities, with states and cities and towns and counties and territories and tribes. Tribal citizens in this country have a lot at stake in whether we have equitable transportation funding. Now's our chance to do all of that and more. So it's the right moment to be looking at the equity implications of everything we do in the federal government, but certainly when it comes to transportation and transit.
So everyone has lots of ideas for you. I'm sure that you're getting lots of people who are calling you, texting you. Everyone who has your cell phone number is probably reaching out to you saying, hey, I've got ideas. New York Magazine did 9 transportation and first electrify every fleet, eliminate the gas tax, dig the Gateway Tunnel. There's like so much. But we had a viewer who also had another idea and a question. And this was Sam Houston, one of our viewers, who asked, I'd love to hear about investments in bridges, highway, and infrastructure to help us prepare for rising sea levels. Do you have an idea about dealing with that?
Yeah, our planning has to reflect the realities of climate change. I mean, first of all, we got to act to prevent climate change from getting worse. Remember, if you look at greenhouse gases, the biggest sector in the U.S. going into that is transportation, which means we can also be the biggest part of the solution. But no matter how good we get, as we must with electrification and reducing emissions, we still know that sea level rise is happening right now. And, the reality is a floodplain map 50 or 100 or even 30 years from now is going to look different than it might have when it was drawn up. So these are the kinds of things that our transportation plans need to take into account. You look at the experience of Sandy, just one example of how, planning and when it comes to roads and bridges and tunnels needs to account for the increased frequency and severity of these weather events. And in fact, the water is just plain higher. And whether you're in a coastal community or a river city in the Midwest, like where I come from, this change is happening. We got to make sure it is factored into our plans. And, a lot of cost-benefit analysis goes on, rightly so, with any government spending. When we're talking about transportation, we got to make sure the costs and the benefits are done in a way that actually accounts for climate reality and climate opportunity.
I think this is why you were called potentially Biden's secret to the climate agenda. We're going to keep you here, please, if you don't mind, over one quick commercial break. So Secretary Pete Buttigieg is going to stay with us. And when we come back, one senator's unique criticism of Secretary Buttigieg's commitment to justice. And we, too, remember Rosa Parks on what would have been her 108th birthday. Secretary Buttigieg tweeted today that his department, as he just mentioned, is committed to honoring her legacy by ensuring equity is central to everything that we do. We'll be right back. After Pete Buttigieg's confirmation on Tuesday, one of the Republicans who voted against his confirmation, Tennessee Senator Bill Hagerty, cited Buttigieg's plans, quote, to use the department for social, racial, and environmental justice causes in his reasons for voting against the confirmation. And Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg is back with me. I certainly hope you do plan to do what you were accused of in that moment. Do you? To use your position for equity.
Absolutely. I thought that was something that everybody could get on board with. Look, why would we want social, environmental, or economic or racial injustice to be attached to our transportation policy? This is a chance to get it right. And look, every time you are spending taxpayer dollars, every time you are shaping American lives, you got to be thinking about whether that is being done in a way that is just or unjust. And, at this moment where the whole country is wrestling with these issues, that should be part of even the most mundane decisions because it affects every part of life in this country.
Yeah. Let's talk really quick about airlines. We talked about trains. There are a lot of furloughs happening, a lot of layoffs going on. The airline industry is hurting because of the pandemic. Do you, in your view, should there be another airline bailout, or is there some other way to help that industry?
Well, there's a lot of active conversation going on right now to make sure that there is the support to get everybody safely in the air. And a lot of it is making sure that we have that perception and reality of safety so that the demand returns. One thing that airlines were compelled to do earlier was kind of figure out one at a time what their policies were going to be. It's why I think the president's swift action on a mask mandate for airplanes and airports really helps the airlines focus on their business and clears up that question and makes it the same across all the carriers. There are so many Americans whose livelihoods depend on the aviation sector. Folks we think about like pilots and flight attendants and ground crews at airports, but also folks you might not think about as much who are involved in the supply chains, even building aircraft who are involved in this too. We've got to make sure that we support this vitally important sector in our country, and we're going to work very hard to do that in the department and in the administration.
And we can't leave out cars when we talk about the whole transportation kind of matrix. Most people, that's the way that they get around if they, are not using a bike, et cetera. My lease is coming up very soon for my truck, and I'm thinking, I want to try to get a hybrid or try to get electric. But in a lot of cases, these are really expensive, right? How can we get to the scale where we can start to convert our automobile, sort of the glut of cars that we have on the road, to more electrics, to make that more accessible?
Well, I think you used the exact right word, which is scale. There's remarkable invention and innovation going on, but what really drives the cost down is when it represents a big chunk or even the majority of sales instead of a small percentage. Now, if you look at what companies are doing, including some of the traditional automakers in Detroit, who are getting very ambitious about electric vehicles, and not just smaller cars, but pickups and other vehicles too, it's incredibly exciting. Now, two things need to happen, I think, for most Americans to be able to make that choice. First, the cost has to pencil out, and they are generally cheaper to own. Obviously, you don't have to fill them up with gas. There are fewer moving parts, but that upfront sticker, we need to watch that come down. But then we also just got to make sure everybody knows they can be confident of being able to find a charging station. The president's commitment to create 500,000 charging stations across the country, I think, is a very important piece of that. Last thing I'll mention, federal government buys a lot of cars. So we got to make sure we're leading by example. That's another thing the president is challenging the agencies to do.
Well, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, if anybody can make transportation cool, you're now the captain of planes, trains, and automobiles. I think you can do it. Toddle over to Fox at some point, see if you can talk some Republicans into voting for this stuff, because I think it would be really helpful. Secretary Pete Buttigieg, congratulations. All the best to you and Chasten. Thank you very much. Appreciate you. All right.